Twilight walked carefully through the fog, taking note of the unusual surroundings. There was no longer snow on the ground. Everywhere she could see was conspicuously missing the distinct feel of winter. In fact, the very air itself seemed to have warmed as well. The wind no longer contained the biting winter chill. In its place was a warm wind that pushed the fog slowly across the town, though it never cleared the unusual weather. "All right, first things first, we should do is find Pinkie Pie. If we find her, we'll be able to find the princess in no time." Spike smiled, looking over the map. "And if we keep heading down this road, we'll make it to Sugar Cube Corner before we know it," Spike said with a grin, creating a separate atmosphere from the fog around them. "Thanks, Spike. Even in this face of crisis, you're still my #1 assistant." Twilight smiled, grateful to have him with her at the moment. Hearing his voice right now was comforting. She had hesitated about taking him with her, feeling that it would have been safer to leave him in the library, where he could lock himself away from any danger, at least until she'd had that vision. Whatever was going on inside the town, she knew Spike wasn't safe back at the library. She wondered if there was any place in town at the moment that would guarantee his safety. Twilight's eyes scanned the buildings as they were walking past, as she came to a slow stop before one. "Huh? What's the matter, Twilight?" Spike asked, wondering why the pony had stopped so suddenly. "Spike? Every single house we're passing seems to have been boarded up just like the library was," Twilight explained, taking a short detour from the route and walking up to the front door. The entrance to the building was closed, but all around she could see wooden planks and boarded-up windows blocking light from entering the buildings. She reached her hoof up to press against the door and heard it jam. She fumbled for it with a bit, hearing the constant jarring sounds of the door as if the locks were broken. "Why do you think that is?" Spike asked, watching Twilight fumbling with the door. "I couldn't say." She paused shortly to contemplate the strange door. "This phenomenon seems to have affected the whole town, which means every pony is likely trapped inside of their homes like we were." Twilight put a hoof to her chin in contemplation. "Which might mean we won't be able to get Pinkie Pie to help us find Celestia." "Well, you never know till you try, right?" Spike said, thinking it over himself. "Besides, if I know Pinkie Pie, I'm sure she's already figured out the puzzle and is getting the store ready for some bad weather parties." "Always the optimist, Spike," Twilight chuckled, turning from the house and walking back to the road toward Sugar Cube Corner. "Hey, someone has to be," Spike grinned, before shifting on Twilight's back and pointing ahead. "Twilight, look! Someone else got out of their house." Twilight quickly looked in the direction, seeing a pony-shaped figure in the fog. "Hey, you're right, Spike! Hey!" Twilight called out, quickly racing towards it. "Hey, did you escape your house too?" The figure in the fog seemed to turn its attention to Twilight, noticing her approaching. Drawing closer, the two of them could discern the figure was wearing a black cloak around its body, its face hidden beneath the hood of its cloak. "Zecora? Is that you?" Twilight asked, finally slowing as she approached, grateful to see her friend. "Oh, Zecora! Thank goodness you're here! Something's happened to Ponyville, and I don't know what. You know more about stuff like this. Do you know what's happening?" The cloaked figure just stood there, continuing to stare at Twilight. Twilight suddenly felt a little uneasy at the staring, having expected to hear the familiar voice of the rhyming zebra. Hello?" Twilight tried to communicate once more. "Any pony there?" "You have a kind look in your eyes that seem surprised." A deep feminine voice escaped from the cloak, the voice seeming to send shivers down Twilight's spine as she took a step back out of instinct. "I fear your life will soon be compromised." My life?" Twilight stammered, and was thrown off balance mentally at the sudden sharpness of the voice before her. "Hey, You're not Sakura. Who are you? She asked, trying to steady herself. She felt vibrations starting to come back to her. Twilight quickly realized that Spike was shaking. Time shall weave and pass through you, and you shall be lost to the whims of the night. Shadows prowl and seek your flesh, which shall tear you apart with loud delight. The cloaked mare began walking slowly backwards into the fog. Hey! Get back here! You haven't answered any of my questions! Twilight yelled, trying to run back to the cloaked figure. With a powerful gust of wind, the figure was covered by fog, before seeming to disappear into thin air. Twilight stared dumbfounded at where the mare had been, looking around for her. There had been no sound of the pony running away, no flash of magic indicating they'd teleported. It was as if they hadn't existed in the first place. Is she gone? Spike asked, managing to stop shaking long enough to look over the top of Twilight's head at where the mare had once stood. Yeah, she is, Spike, but I have no idea where she went. Twilight was baffled at this. It wasn't an illusion. Both of them had heard the mare talk. Something about her had scared Spike, and she herself had felt a sense of unease and dread upon hearing the mare's voice. We should keep moving. Sugar Cube Corner isn't much further, Twilight said to Spike, gulping down the anxiety building in her throat. Right. We should just continue heading forward, Spike said hesitantly, looking into the fog for the bakery. Suddenly, the strange fog seemed a lot more menacing than it had moments ago. Right. Twilight nodded her head, before slowly continuing with her walk. Her hoof steps seemed unusually loud now, each step seeming to echo against the cobblestone streets. She hadn't been paying attention before, but the echoing steps truly told her the town was apparently empty. Twilight? Do you hear that? Spike said, panic starting in his voice. Twilight stopped walking as she heard a distant sound of metal scraping against the cobblestone. She perked her ears to hone in on the sound, hearing it several times in short succession. Clank, 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 clank. The rhythm of the scraping metal was in tune to some pony walking, but there was more to it than that. She narrowed her eyes in the direction before her, the direction the sound was coming from. She tried to focus on what was making the sound, beginning to see another faint figure in the fog, slowly heading towards them. It was then that another metal sound was heard. It was the sound of metal being dragged along the ground. Who's there? Twilight called out to the figure. The figure began to grow more defined as it slowly grew closer to her. It didn't respond. Twilight, there's more, Spike said quickly, turning the unicorn's head to look elsewhere in the fog. Twilight's eyes widened, catching sight of more figures beginning to appear in the haze of the fog. Each figure brought with it that scraping metal of their hoofsteps, as well as dragging something metal along the ground. This unnerved Twilight. She could feel the hair standing on the back of her neck. There was something very wrong with what was happening around her. She slowly began to walk backwards, away from the creatures as they approached. Hey, stop freaking us out! Just tell us who you are! Twilight cried out, trying to get answers. But all of her questioning was in vain. The figures just continued to approach. She swept her gaze back and forth rapidly between the approaching enigmas in the fog, trying to determine why they were cornering her and Spike. She counted at least 5 now, in a half circle around them. They were trying to stop her from continuing forward, as if they didn't want her to go to Sugar Cube Corner. Twilight turned her attention to the first one she'd spotted. For a moment, she froze in horror, staring at the creature that had appeared from the fog. It looked to be in the shape of a pony, but there was no way Twilight could discern it as being one. The creature was wearing armor, although it was different from the royal guards she'd seen in Canterlot. The armor was thicker and covering much more of its body, reaching under their bellies and down their flanks. The armor was rusted away with age, covered in battle scars from what must have been many battles. The shape and design of the armor was unlike anything Twilight had seen. The armor seemed to have a much more ancient design. But it wasn't the armor that sent fear down her spine. It was the simple look at the face of the creature. It had no eyes. Its skin was barely holding onto its face, rotted and diseased. If the creature had an identity, it was long ago. The rest of the skin was exposed through the armor, shared the same fate. Twilight couldn't comprehend how the creature was standing, let alone walking towards her. In its mouth, it was dragging a hefty double-edged sword along the ground. It seemed to have difficulty holding it, yet it was unhindered with its advance. "Zombie pony!" Spike yelled, suddenly scared out of his mind. "Spike! Calm down! There's no such thing as zombie ponies!" Twilight cried back at the terrified dragon, doing everything she could to keep herself calm too. Though she was berating him now, he had snapped her back to reality. She turned her head back to the deformed creature and forced a smile onto her face, despite the sweat beginning to fall from it. "Excuse me, you seem to be hurt, but please, let me help." The air was punctured with a loud metallic clang that reverberated through the air. Twilight stood like a ghost, staring before her where the blade of the creature's sword had embedded into the ground, just mere inches away from her. She had just narrowly escaped, no longer having a head. Twilight stood there, paralyzed by the sudden situation, as the soldier-like creature slowly pulled the blade out of the ground, adjusting it in his mouth for a better grip. He began lifting it up for another strike at the terrified unicorn. "Twilight! Twilight, run!" Spike shouted straight into her ear. The petrified pony felt her heart skip a beat, and life return to her veins. Her mind finally getting the message to her legs. Her body jumped back, instinctively moving out of the way of danger as the sword came striking down once more, cleaving through the cobblestone with ease. Twilight turned on her hooves to run, noticing the approach of the other creatures. 5 of these things were walking towards her, some dragging swords, some dragging spears, and one of them was dragging an axe. Adrenaline coursed through her, and her hooves began to pound the ground with force, careening her body forward with barely any idea of where she was heading. She just ran from these abominations of nature, knowing they intended to kill her and her number 1 assistant. She'd never forgive herself if harm came to the baby dragon. The sound of scraping metal suddenly increased. She dared to glance behind her, seeing the armored creatures chasing after her. They had slowly shambled towards her, but now they were in full pursuit behind her. Her mind was in full panic, turning to look in front of her once more. She was running straight for a house, one she recognized as the house for sale near Sugar Cube Corner. The sides were boarded up just like the rest of the town. Twilight instantly realized that it must have been a dead end. She looked to her sides. The creatures were preparing their weapons to strike down at her if she drew close as they chased her. If she didn't head straight for the house, she wouldn't be a whole unicorn for very long. She gulped down panic that had lodged in her throat and put her efforts into one last-ditch effort. She had to get through the door, no matter what. Her horn lit up, surrounding the door with magic. She instantly tried the lock on the off chance that it would open, before thinking she'd ram into it to break through, and the door opened. By some miracle, as if it had known that she was in peril, the door gave way to her magic. By Celestia, she counted the thanks and slipped straight through the doorway, slamming it closed behind her. With a moment of rest, she whipped her head around, looking for something, anything, to barricade the door with. When her eyes fell upon the couch inside the dark, musty room, she instantly surrounded it with her magic and slammed the furniture against the door, firmly holding it in place. Seconds passed, as Twilight braced the couch against the door, slowly backing away from it. She could feel the sweat pouring down her face like bullets, nervous and anxiety building up in her, as she didn't know what was going to happen. A brief time felt like agonizing minutes, not knowing what was going to happen next. Wood splintered and broke, the shrapnel flying across the room as Twilight shrieked. A sword slashed through the thick wooden walls. The sword got caught in the fixtures of the wall for a brief moment before sliding back out. Spike cried out in terror, gripping hard against Twilight's neck, practically choking her. Twilight couldn't speak up in protest, only stare in horror as the next weapon broke through the wood and foundations. It was the head of a spear. A sword slashed through next, followed by an axe right next to it. Her heart beat in her throat as she panicked. Shallowed breaths echoed in her ears, struggling to get air into her lungs. The weapons wailed on the walls, creating several holes and lacerations into the door and walls. They were desperately trying to break their way in. Twilight didn't know if they would be able to break through, but she was terrified that they would. The axe bore its way through the door once more, pausing as it sank back into the door frame. Twilight stared at it, waiting for the continued destruction of their weapons. The axe slowly withdrew from the door, and for brief moments Twilight could hear the scraping metal footsteps growing quiet. The creatures were leaving them alone. For whatever reason, they'd stopped their assault. Are they gone?" Spike asked, not daring to look at the door the creatures had so anxiously been striking at. It was then that words finally got to her brain that Spike was strangling her. "Spike can't breathe." The words barely escaped her lips. "Oh, Twilight, I'm so sorry." Spike apologized and instantly let go of her neck, letting Twilight inhale as much needed breath of air. She gasped and panted for a moment, letting the musty air fill her lungs before coughing it back out, crashing down into a lying position on her belly. "I have been better, Spike," Twilight finally managed to mutter, starting to feel the rush wear off. With her body calming down, her mind could finally start to process what exactly it was that had just happened to them. "Twilight, what were those things? They looked like zombies. Zombies wielding swords and spears and axes." Spike grabbed his head, the baby dragon starting to freak out. "They tried to attack us. We almost lost our heads. I thought zombie ponies weren't supposed to be real." Spike was now in full panic mode. "Spike," Twilight gasped for air, standing up slowly, looking at the rumbling, frantic dragon. "Spike, calm down." She spoke calmly, the baby dragon looking up at her, his mind still racing. "Calm down? Calm down? Did you see what almost happened to us?" he cried desperately, waving his hands at the splintered wall and door. "I did, Spike, but panicking about our situation isn't going to help it," Twilight said, taking a deep breath. "We know we're in a bad situation, but if you panic, you only make the bad situation worse." "Are you lecturing me?" Spike asked, almost shocked. "Now, of all times?" Twilight blinked, a bit confused, before smiling softly at the baby dragon, amused by his statement. It was true. She was giving him a bit of an unusual lecture. But seeing the young dragon she cared for so much being frantic seemed to spark some instinct inside of her that told her she needed to keep him calm. The same instinct that told her to bring him with her was now telling her she needed to make sure he was going to be all right, that his well-being was more important than her own. The feeling told her that she couldn't let what had just transpired to get to her for Spike's sake. "Maybe a little, but listen, if we panic, we're just going to make bad decisions. And if we make bad decisions, we're going to run into those things again." "Zombies," Spike interrupted. "Spike, do you really believe we were chased down by zombies?" Twilight asked, unsure of the answer. "Well, they looked like zombies, sounded like zombies, and attacked us like zombies. I'm going with zombies." Spike listed off the reasons on his fingers. "Fine. So zombies are apparently real." Twilight did not find comfort in that statement. "The better question is, what are they doing in Ponyville, and why?" She looked over at the splintering wall once more. "There has to be some reason, some explanation that'll tell us what's going on here." "This is bad, Twilight. What if they're turning the whole town into a zombie horde as we speak?" Spike shivered at the thought of being attacked by a massive army of the creatures. I don't think that's likely, Spike. Twilight put a hoof to her chin as she thought about the creatures, how they looked. Though, you're right that their skin and manner of moving was similar to the stories about zombies. They were still different from those stories. For one thing, they were all wearing armor. If they were ponies from this town, why would they be wearing such regal-looking armor? Twilight began to pace as she thought. Second of all, they attacked us with weapons. The zombies from many stories we've heard about attacked by biting and spread infection that way. If they were trying to amass an army, they would want to infect us in one piece. Well, maybe they're really confused zombies. You know, how they lose control of their thoughts when they turn, Spike said, trying to give favor to his argument. Let's focus, Spike. Twilight shook her head. The biggest problem here is that those zombies are roaming the town. They're likely attacking innocent ponies. We have to find Celestia and put a stop to this. But how are we going to do that? We can't even go out the front door. Those things are probably waiting for us. Spike motioned once more to the broken front door. Twilight had to admit, even she was unwilling to go out that door now. I guess we're going to have to find another way out. Twilight looked around the room, getting a good look at it now that she wasn't being distracted by fear for her life, or Spike's rambling about zombie ponies. They were in the house's living room. The couch that had been in the middle of it was now pressed against the splintered door. The center of the room had a broken table split down the middle and was lying in pieces. There were several doorways scattered about the living room, one leading to the kitchen, one to what looked like a closet, and one to what seemed like a basement that was boarded up, and one leading to a bathroom that was also boarded up. Then there were stairs to the upper room, a balcony that would be seen from the first floor that showed doors to the second floor. All right. I have no idea whose house we're in right now, though it doesn't look like anyone's lived here in quite some time. Twilight turned towards the opening to the kitchen and walked towards it. As she entered, she finally began to notice just how dark it was inside of the house. She could barely see anything within the kitchen. Her instinct was to start casting the light spell. Then a thought occurred to her. If she was using the light spell and had to switch to a different spell, the light would cut out and she'd be stuck in the dark. If there was a monster in hiding waiting to attack her, she wouldn't be able to see where she needed to defend herself. This was a problem. Twilight took a moment to think about it, knowing full well she still needed the light. As she shifted her hoof up to her chin to think, the material of her pendant brushed against it. Surprised, she looked down to remind herself that she was still wearing the pendant from the Canterlot archives. Oh, of course! She smiled to herself, being reminded of it. She pressed her hoof against it, and the crystal came to life, illuminating the world before her. The part of the pendant that was used to read books was now serving as her lantern. Now she could see what she was able to see. She quickly gave the kitchen a glance over. The kitchen hadn't fared much better than the living room. Many of the counters were a broken mess, worn away with age and rotting. Many of the doors to the cupboards were loosely hanging on the hinges that were left over with rust and age. Cracks covered the floor, and there were brown and red stains littered throughout the kitchen. However, Twilight's eyes fell upon what she was looking for. A back door that was neatly placed at the end of the kitchen. It must have been a patio door, and if they could get into the backyard, they could get around these creatures out front. Twilight's hoof reached out to the door and tried the knob, hearing the distinct sound of it being locked. Of course it is, Twilight sighed, looking down at the handle. Seeing a keyhole similar to the one that she had seen inside of her house, she realized it must be similar to the situation in her own home. Somewhere within this house was a key to the door, probably hidden within some dumb box puzzle she needed to figure out. Twilight quickly returned to the living room, illuminating Spike with her pendant, causing him to be blinded momentarily. Hey, watch where you point that thing, Spike said, covering his eyes. Oh, sorry, Spike. Twilight chuckled softly before walking up to him keeping the light directly out of his eyes. There's a door in the kitchen that looks like a way out. However, it's locked by a similar lock that was on our front door. I'm going to go upstairs to see if I can find a key. Oh, well, alright. I can search downstairs for anything. Spike smiled, ready to help. Actually, Spike, I was hoping you'd just stay down here and not go exploring. I don't know what could be waiting for us in this house, or if those things are coming to attack us again. If you stay here, I can hear you shout for me, and I can come to you quickly, Twilight explained, as best she could to her assistant. But... Spike began to protest. No buts, Spike. I can take care of myself, but I have to be able to take care of you too. It's safe here for the moment, so please, wait for me to look upstairs. I won't be longer than a minute or two, and if you need me, I'm a single shot away, okay? Twilight pleaded to the baby dragon, hoping that he'd understand. Spike hesitated for a moment, fiddling with his fingers, looking unsure of what he should do. All right, Twilight, but if you need me, call me right away, okay? Spike said, giving her a look of determination in return. Thank you, Spike, Twilight said quickly, nuzzling against him. Yeah, just go find the key and be safe, all right? Normally Spike would protest against the show of affection, but considering their circumstances, it seemed appropriate. I will, Spike. I'm not about to leave you alone. And Twilight nodded, giving him one last reassuring smile before turning and proceeding up to the second floor. Each step on the stairwell gave a loud, groaning creak to each of her hoof steps. She worried that with the age of the structure, that one wrong step and she would find herself with a leg stuck in broken, splintered wood. However, the stairwell seemed to hold up, and she was soon on the balcony of the second floor. She looked down at the living room of the second floor, seeing Spike looking back up at her. Anywhere from the balcony, she'd have a good view of the first floor, so she could easily jump to Spike's aid at any time. She turned and headed back to look at the doors on the second floor. She counted 6 in total, though 2 of the doors were bolted up with wooden panels. Twilight turned to the closest unbarred door. It was the only door just to the left of the stairwell. She tried pushing it open. It creaked as its hinges moved. Twilight swept the light slowly across the room, checking to see if anything was amiss. The room looked to be some old library, or perhaps a study room. There were bookshelves that were now deprived of books, gathering dust and cobwebs with time. A few blank papers were scattered on the floor near an old rotting desk. On the other side of the room, she spotted something unusual. Sitting on the top of a chair was a safe that looked much too heavy for the chair to be holding, yet somehow it did. On the front of the safe there was a piece of paper that appeared to have some messy writing on it. Twilight quickly walked over to the safe, examining it carefully. It just seemed to be a normal cast-iron dial safe that was unlocked with a number combination. Her horn lit with magic as she grabbed hold of the paper on the safe and lifted it up to her face to read. Part of the key is locked away here. I locked it away so that it won't hurt us again. If you want the key, you must answer the riddles 3, for only the combined answers will unlock the key. If you find nothing, then you're not there yet. But if you find more than me, then you've gone too far. At sunrise, the foals come out to play. They played all day as the sun began to set and the moon rose above their heads. They continued to play despite the night, never tiring or growing weary. They did not stop till they saw the sunrise once more, and then they tried back to their homes. In my collection, I have but 4 ponies, though sadly 2 befell to an accident and lost a leg each. It's unfortunate to say, but the legs will suffice. Just need to make a small change. Twilight thought about the note for a moment. After all, it just seemed like a random set of riddles set up for her to answer. She looked at the safe, then back at the note, and then pondered what the words meant in her head. I suppose the answer is the combination to the safe? Which means the answer to all these riddles must be the numbers. Twilight looked back at the riddles and read them again carefully, looking for the answer to the puzzle. She racked her brain for a few minutes, going over possible solutions in her head. However, she finally came down to a set of numbers that made sense to her. All right. 1, 24, 14. She spoke aloud as she turned the dial back and forth. As the dial landed on the final number, it let out a satisfying click, informing her that she had solved the puzzle. She opened the door safe and peered inside, hoping to find the key to the downstairs door. There were 2 things inside of the safe, none of which were a key. She sighed, a little disappointed, though somehow not surprised, before inspecting the items there. The first thing her eyes came upon was an iron helmet. It seemed strange for her that the item would be randomly in the safe. She picked it up with her magic and inspected it. It looked almost brand new. It shined in the light of her pendant. She pondered about just leaving it there. Then something in her gut told her that it might be useful. She wasn't exactly sure how a random helmet would be useful, but at the same time she remembered back to the items she had obtained after solving the puzzles in her own home. The iron helmet soon vanished, being stored safely within her magic. The other item in the safe was a strange ancient coin with weird markings on it. She levitated it closer, inspecting it. At first she couldn't tell what it was, but as she looked it over, memories of books she's read in Canterlot came to mind. The strange designs on the coins were of the ancient equestrian. The circle had a metallic extension on the back for embedding it on clothing or armor, and as her magic surrounded it, she could feel a soft pulse emanating from it. This is an enchanted medallion. They used to imbue magical properties into items without them. Twilight was fascinated at having discovered it in the safe. Judging by the age, it must be at least 4,000 years old. But, despite its age, it still holds magical charge. Equestrian magic is truly amazing. She smiled in wonder at the device. Twilight dropped the medallion as she nearly jumped out of her skin. Instinct made her jump away from the medallion as it began to make distorted, garbled sounds. She stared at it in shock, not sure what to make of the noises. She thought she could hear a voice playing through the strange noise. Ed, hell, lone, her, on, away. Twilight could do nothing but stare in horror until the medallion finally grew quiet. She had no idea what had just happened with it. She'd never known medallions to store voice or sounds before. Sure, it was the basis for some musical instruments that was developed recently, but it was technology beyond what ponies would have had thousands of years ago. She slowly approached the medallion and tapped it with a hoof. It didn't seem to be doing anything now. She wondered if the sound had been triggered because she'd been pouring magic into the device, as if there were many items that required a regular charge with unicorn magic. Twilight levitated the medallion once more, and gently poured some more of her magic into the device, expecting to hear the sound start up once more. She was baffled at the silence it produced. She twirled the medallion around, inspecting it from every angle she could, but nothing came from it. It was almost as if the whole thing had just been her imagination. Her brow furrowed in frustration at the strange piece of metal in front of her. She resigned herself to just putting it away into her magic repository and forgetting about it for the moment. She made space in her magic reservoir for it and attempted to place it inside. However, the coin refused to budge. Though she could lift it, for some reason it refused to go into her holding space. Hey, what gives? Twilight glared at the coin, trying several times to get it to vanish from her sight and find a place inside of her magic, but it simply refused. She let out a huff in frustration at the medallion. Maybe it's enchanted not to work with this kind of spell. Which is stupid. Why would it be enchanted against being carried inside a magic vessel? She groaned before thinking about what to do with it. She examined the metal extension in the back, noticing there was a thin and strong, able to be clamped down hard to either cloth or metal, depending on what was going to be enchanted. She looked down at the string of her pendant. The medallion's metal extension slipped into the string and snapped closed, now firmly attached to her pendant. There. Now I'll be able to keep hold of it. She wasn't sure what she was going to need it for, but the note said that these items would lead her to the key to unlock the back door, so she needed to take them with her. With nothing else notably interesting in the room, Twilight turned and exited the room. She looked over the railing to see that Spike seemed to have found a candle and lit it with his fire. He was staring at some pictures that were hanging on the walls around the living room. "You okay, Spike?" Twilight called down to him, causing the baby dragon to look up. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just looking at some stuff down here," he replied. "All right, just be careful. I don't want you getting hurt." She was still worried about what might happen to him if she was gone for too long. "I know. Don't worry so much. I'll be fine down here." Spike nodded his head before looking back at the pictures. Twilight smiled softly at the young dragon. It wasn't very often that he knew how to take a situation seriously, but it seemed he was able to do so this time. She was grateful for that calm rationality was going to keep them from getting hurt. Twilight turned her head back to the doors, examining the next open one. The door closest to where she had just left was boarded up, leaving the next door down the hallway open. The creaking floor punctuated her every step as she approached the door. Twilight's ear twitched as she approached it. She could hear something faint from behind the door, something that sounded like another pony. She quickly pressed her hoof against the door and pushed it open, walking into a large open room. The walls were decorated with ornamental armors and weapons of varying shapes and sizes, all ones Twilight was able to recognize as made only to be displayed, not used. Banners decorated with the symbols of Equestria hung in the corners, and the floor was covered with a red velvet carpet. At the opposite end of the room looked to be the statue of a pony, standing on its hind legs made of bronze, holding in its hooves a worn-down, rusted old sword, with words written on the wall above it. In the center of the ceiling appeared to be fresh bloodstain that was slowly dripping blood into a pool. The most striking thing about the room, however, was that Twilight could hear the soft sobs of a mare crying. She looked around the room, but couldn't see a single pony where the sound would originate. "Hello?" Twilight called out, walking further into the room. She stopped for a moment when she heard the medallion on her pendant begin to hiss quietly with a static sound. She stared at it for a moment, wondering if it would go quiet. When it didn't, she decided to ignore it for the moment, and continued trying to contact the pony in distress. "Hello?" She called again, though there was no response, just the continued sad sobbing. "Hello? Is any pony here?" Twilight tried desperately to call out to the pony that seemed to be in distress. She called out to her several more times, but all she got was silence in return. "I don't get it. I can hear them. Why can't they hear me?" She wondered aloud to herself. She slowly walked over to the statue of the pony and examined it. It seemed to be a soldier, dressed and ready for battle, though he seemed to be missing his helmet. Twilight glanced up at and looked at the wall with the writing. "Equestria, our nation, shall be defended in honor. For the peace of every citizen who wishes only freedom and love, we raise our shields and swords for them. We must be ready for battle, should our ideals ever come to harm." Twilight pulled out the helmet from her magical pool. She wasn't sure how this was going to help her get a key to leave the house, but she knew that the riddle was telling her to do. She levitated the helm down onto the statue's head. It fitted with a snug click. The statue suddenly moved, causing Twilight to step back in surprise. The four legs of the statue that were tightly holding onto the rusted old sword in its hooves lifted up slowly, before separating, letting go of its grip on the blade. The blade fell to the ground and landed with a small clatter. Twilight looked at the chipped blade curiously. The blade had a purple jewel just below the white bandaged, wrapped handle, presumably to give it a better and less painful grip when held in the mouth. The guard looked like it was made out of dark bone. She could clearly see the massive amount of chips in the steel blade, as if it had been through many battles and left unrepaired for years, rusting away in this spot now. She levitated the blade up carefully to get a better look at it. As she did, the medallion around her neck began to cry out with a loud, distorted buzz. The room suddenly shook as the gentle sobbing turned into a loud, heart-wrenching scream. Twilight felt her skin jump as she quickly turned around. The room shook once more with a loud thud, and she looked back and forth, trying to find the origin of the loud noise. Another thud shook the room, and she heard a loud crack reverberate throughout. She turned her head up to the ceiling, seeing specks of debris falling down as something slammed into it. She bolted her attention to the door and tried to make a run for it, to escape from the room. Another ear-piercing scream shrieked through the room, as one last thud shook the room. The ceiling burst from the weight of the strike, and knocked Twilight back as debris and rubble hit the floor. Twilight coughed and gagged on the dust that was billowing from the floor, turning her attention to look at what had just crashed through the ceiling. A gigantic figure was hanging from some abyss above the ceiling. Its legs disappeared into the abyss, showing just a large torso and head below. Its body was long, and its skin was rotted, marred with scars and wrapped in tightly bound chains. It was missing one of its forelegs. The other was bound, broken, and misshapen under the chains. The head of the creature brought horror to Twilight, as this creature was also missing its eyes. But more than that, the ears looked as though they had been put through the shredder and were barely hanging on. Teeth were missing from its mouth, and it was profusely bleeding from the skull, likely where it had been repeatedly struck the ceiling to be free. The creature let out a distinctive, mare-like screech that felt like it would pop Twilight's ears. She folded her ears down and backed away from the creature, hitting her back against the wall. Adrenaline instantly shot through her veins as she stared down the creature. It writhed in agony at its bindings. It began to thrash back and forth in the room, screeching and wailing in horrific pain. Twilight could only stare, feeling her heart thundering against her chest at the sight. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know what happened to it, and the last time she'd encountered a creature, it had tried to kill her. The creature stopped its thrashing for a moment, breathing heavily. Its head seemed to focus on Twilight. Twilight freezing in fear. It was as if the creature had noticed her thoughts, and had turned its attention to her. With another screech, its head lunged straight at Twilight, mouth open wide, intent on biting down on her. Twilight barely managed to jump out of the way in time, as the creature crashed into the wall Twilight had been standing next to. Twilight's hooves slipped for a moment, but she got to her feet, instinctively levitating the sword in front of her defensively. She'd never wielded a sword before, but even back during the days of Canterlot. The princess had asked if she would be interested in any weapon training, but she had always been focused on studying magic. Right now, she had wished that she had done some training. The shrieking creature pulled its body back and shook with pain and anguish, crying out constantly. "Please, stop!" Twilight yelled at the creature, watching it spasm under the chains. "I don't want to hurt you. If you'll just calm down, I can help you," she pleaded to the creature, trying to get it to listen to reason. The creature refused the offer, swinging its body straight for Twilight. She jumped out of the way once more, the creature smashing into the wall. Twilight tried to keep her balance, but the creature wasn't wasting time this time. It pulled back quickly and thrust itself forward once more at Twilight. Twilight gasped in shock and tried to dodge out of the way again, holding the sword up to try and soften the blow. The creature's face grazed the side of the sword as it wailed in pain, before striking the side of Twilight's body. She felt her body get knocked to the side as it smashed into the wall once more. She groaned, feeling the impact on her sides. She knew, however, that she didn't have time to wait and adjust to her new bruises. She scrambled to her feet as the creature began to pull back once more. The constant, horrific yell was piercing straight into her. The cry of pain and agony was permeating the soul. "Stop! Please! I don't want to hurt you!" Twilight cried out desperately to the creature, trying to make it stop its assault. The creature roared out, its jaw crashing into her body. She let out a horrific gasp in surprise as suddenly the room seemed to flip upside down. She could feel the powerful jaw of the creature beginning to dig into her flesh. She shrieked, crying out in agony as the teeth began to dig deeper, trying to devour her alive. The sword swung through the air, stabbing straight into the creature's throat. The creature's jaw opened wide in agony. Twilight tumbled out as she began to flail across the room, crashing and smashing into the walls all over the room. Twilight gasped and panted for air, a hoof rubbing her neck as she stood up. The creature's wails filled her mind as she was able to spot the sword she'd been wielding embedded into its throat. Her horn quickly lit up, and her magic grabbed the handle of it, ripping the sword quickly from its throat. Its head slammed into the floor, shaking the whole room. Twilight's legs shook with it, trying to keep herself standing and stable, aiming the sword towards the creature once more. The creature didn't wait for another opportunity. It bellowed its wretched cry and rushed straight for Twilight, its mouth open wide to take her down. Twilight didn't wait for it to get close. With a swift thrust, the blade soared through the air and stabbed the creature in its mouth. This didn't seem to falter the creature, as it still aimed to take Twilight down. She dodged out of the way, its jaws reaching where she had just been standing, and snapped shut on top of her blade. Her horn lit up, pouring a huge amount of her magic into the hold of the blade, and forced the blade out of its mouth, dragging blood and teeth with it as it soared out. The creature's head rammed into the ground once more, as if trying to silence the pain, as its blood began to spill and drench the room with its constant movements. Twilight held the sword up over her, every nerve in her body firing at once to react, to attack, to not let this thing take her out of this world. The creature cried out, its jaws mashing, wanting to devour Twilight. Twilight levitated the sword up, her eyes flashing white as she grit her teeth, her nostrils flaring as a triumphant wind picked up in the room. Debris began to pick up, the splinters of the decorative weapons and armor beginning to circle in a cyclone of air. Twilight glared at the creature, the sword beginning to focus on her magical rage. The creature lunged for her, mouth open and screaming. Twilight cried out in return, forcing all the air out of her lungs as she yelled like she had never yelled before. The sword drove through the air, guided by the magical force. The blade struck the creature, striking the bottom of its jaw and straight through its skull, embedding itself onto the floor. The creature writhed and shook, its body going into uncontrolled spasms. Twilight panted heavily as she watched, the creature's agony spilling out before her. She waited as the creature began to shake less and less. Finally, the creature grew still and quiet. Her medallion became silent as well. Twilight panted as her magic began to calm. Her eyes stopped blazing white, and she could feel the efforts of all the adrenaline coursing through her veins beginning to fade as the situation was no longer one of life and death. Her legs began to shake, no longer able to support her weight. She collapsed to her knees as her mind began to reel, her breathing not slowing as the horror of what just happened began to crash down with full force. "Twilight! Twilight, are you okay?" Spike cried out, finally able to get the door to open, and came rushing into the room, only to stop. He could see everything. The dead creature impaled through the head on the floor, the blood that was splattered throughout the room, the horrible mess, the destruction that had come from it crashing through the ceiling and destroying the walls and decorations. But most of all, he could see Twilight, staring at him, shaking in place with wide eyes as she was beginning to deal with what had just happened. Her body was spattered with blood, some of it being her own. "Twilight," Spike gasped, having difficulty taking in the sight for himself. He was rendered speechless. "Spike." Twilight's voice quivered, shook as much as her body did. Her eyes began to shudder as much as her breath. I killed a living creature." The fear was evident in her voice. The pain and grief of what she had done was striking her. Spike could see the tears that were quickly beginning to flow down Twilight's cheeks. I killed it, she hiccuped and gasped, as her face contorted. She was trying to hold back her sobs, trying to hold back her pain and anguish. But there was no stopping it, and Spike could see it. He rushed over to Twilight and threw his arms around her neck. Twilight broke out into loud, painful sobs into the dragon's shoulder, her hooves holding him close as she could.